Hello there, it's Dr. Driver here to talk to you about the Chaucer biography. Okay, hold on, let me get this thing under. Oh, wait, what was that? Oh, erg. Yeah. Alright, here you are, and here we are, and we're on to 19 seconds already. First thing I'm going to do is go over the timeline, which is actually in the Chaucer file, so you might want to get that out. Then I'm going to flesh it out a little bit with the biography from the Dictionary of National Biography, which is also in your Chaucer file. Okay, Chaucer is born during what was called the 100 Years' War, where England claimed France as English, which the French were not too pleased about. And of course, the great heroine in that war was Joan of Arc. The 100 Years' War lasts from 1337 to 1453. Also, in the 14th century, you get the Black Death, the plagues that ran across Europe and killed up to what is estimated as 2/3 of the population. So that's also going on. Chaucer is born somewhere around 1340. Here is a kind of blurry picture from the Ellesmere Chaucer, which is, of course, the manuscript in the Huntington Library in California. Chaucer's born around 1340. His father is a successful wine merchant in London. And Chaucer probably learns Italian and French from living in that particular neighborhood of London. The Black Death recurs from about 1348 to 50. Then, as a young man, we see on the records Chaucer was in service as a page in the household of Elizabeth de Burgh, Countess of Ulster. Now that's interesting because Chaucer's middle class and the aspirations of the middle class were to rise to the noble class, which was made possible in part by the Black Death that killed off so many people. But the middle class aspired through marriage, through careful placement of their children in noble households, to become noble themselves. And in fact, Chaucer is successful at this. He marries up, which is always the goal in the Middle Ages. You marry, usually in an arranged marriage, to further the interest of your family. And Chaucer marries up, and his granddaughter is a duchess. So in a way, the Chaucer family was very successful. But obviously, Chaucer was placed in this household of a noblewoman to learn all the skills of court, which is more or less how people were educated, how children were educated. There were schools, too, but if you had aspirations for your kid, you would send him to a noble household to learn how that functioned. Chaucer is fighting in the 100 Years' War. He's in France. He's captured, and King Edward III contributes ransom to his capture. So he's released. Some scholars have made a big deal about this. Other scholars say that Edward III paid as much to ransom his horse as he did for Chaucer. But Chaucer then becomes an emissary. He's still a very young man, carrying letters from Calais to England for Lionel, the Earl of Ulster. In 1365, Chaucer marries Philippa Rowett, who was a lady-in-waiting to Queen Philippa. Ladies-in-waiting on royalty were noble women. They weren't servants exactly. They were noble women who were allowed to do things like dress the queen. So also, ladies-in-waiting had to travel with their noble patrons. So Philippa Rowett is the wife of Chaucer. Her sister had a long-term affair with John of Gaunt, who was a duke, and he eventually marries her. So Chaucer's marrying in a family that's actually quite close to the nobility. Chaucer and Philippa have a son, Thomas, who becomes a prosperous landholder and a respected member of Parliament. In 1366, Chaucer travels to Spain, we assume that it was a diplomatic mission. On 1365, Chaucer is given an annuity by the king of 20 marks for life. It's like having an income. Chaucer here is described as his valet or his valet. So he's got some kind of position in the royal household. In 1369, he becomes an esquire, which is a step up from valet in the royal household, and he goes off to fight with John of Gaunt in northern France. In 1370, Chaucer travels again to the continent in the king's service. In 1372 to 73, Chaucer is commissioned to establish an English seaport for Genoese trade. So he goes to Italy. He travels to Genoa and Florence, which are cities that are very influential, particularly Florence, on his literary development, because Florence was the home of Francis Petrarch, who was a great Italian poet, who actually writes the first sonnet sequence 200 years before Shakespeare, and also Giovanni Boccaccio, whose Decameron seems to have influenced Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. Okay, so he's doing that. In 1374, Edward III grants Chaucer a pitcher of wine daily for his duties. He gets a house above Aldgate. So they had houses on gates. It would be a little like having a house on Brooklyn Bridge these days. People lived on the gates over water or over walls, the city walls in London. Chaucer then becomes the controller of wool custom and subsidy for the Port of London. So this is the part of Chaucer's career when he's basically an accountant looking at the wools that are going in and out of the port and making sure the taxes are handled correctly and that the finances are handled correctly. So Chaucer is an accountant, among other things. In 1377, Chaucer goes to France and Flanders on the king's secret business, and he assists at the negotiations at Montreuil-sur-Mer for peace, and in Paris for the marriage of Prince Richard. And the reign of Richard II begins. Richard II is a very important figure in Chaucer's life. Richard II loved the arts. He supported poets. He was also a very expensive king and raised taxes, which people didn't like. But Richard II is certainly a major figure in Chaucer's life. And of course, as you may recall, Richard II will be overthrown and essentially murdered by his cousin, Henry of Derby, who will become Henry IV. But that happens later. I'm getting ahead of myself. Okay, in 1378, Chaucer sent back to Italy again as an emissary of some kind. His Italian must be fluent, one would assume. 1381, Chaucer receives a gift of 22 pounds from Richard II for his diplomatic service in France, and there's the Peasants' Revolt. Briefly, the Peasants' Revolt involved native English workers rising up against immigrants, interesting, in the 14th century and killing them. Actually killing them in the streets of London because they felt these people were taking away their jobs, which was not really the case. Anyway, the Peasants' Revolt was put down. Eventually, Richard II rides out and talks to them and makes a deal with them and then actually condemns a lot of them to death for violence against immigrants. So that's what was going on in 1381. What has changed? In 1385 to 86, Chaucer becomes the Justice of the Peace, so he's also a judge in Kent, which is outside of London. In 1386, Chaucer is elected to Parliament as Knight of the Shire. This did not mean he was actually a knight. Knight of the Shire means he's a member of Parliament. Okay, so he's not a knight, it's just a title. Knight of the Shire. Now, what's a shire? Well, if you've read Tolkien, you know a shire is like a county is to us. At this point, Chaucer retires as the controller of the port of London, and Richard II's power is weakened. In 1389, Richard gains power. Richard II regains power, and I'm just changing the image here so you can see a portrait of Chaucer with the book open. It's a young Chaucer in the Lansdowne manuscript of Canterbury Tales. So Richard is basically attacked by the Hawks in Parliament because of his pacifism. The Hawks want war because that means money for them. He loses power. He comes back in 1389, and Chaucer is appointed the clerk, or clerk in American, of the King's works with responsibility for construction. So now he's overseeing construction works at Westminster, the Tower of London, and castles and manors. So he's worn many hats already. So this writing is not a full-time job, even in the 14th century. He's got to have a lot of day jobs to support his writing habit. In 1390, Chaucer is given the responsibility over all the walls, ditches, and other works on the Thames River between Woolwich and Greenwich. In 1391, Chaucer retires from that and he becomes a deputy forester. So he has to oversee the forest land of the Royal Forest of North Petherton, Somerset. In 1393, Richard II awards Chaucer £10 for good service, and then in the next year grants Chaucer an annuity of £20 for life. And his final gift, Richard II's final gift, before he's deposed, is 252 gallons of wine a year for life. That's a fair number of bottles of wine. In 1399, Richard II is deposed, and Henry IV, upon his accession to the throne, renews Richard's gifts to Chaucer and grants him an additional annuity of 40 marks. Interestingly, Chaucer then leases a residence in the garden of the Lady Chapel of Westminster Abbey. Now, in the Middle Ages, the church offered sanctuary. Sanctuary meant if you had committed a crime or you were wanted by the government or for whatever reason, the church would offer safe ground to you. This is also used to be true of universities. I'm not sure if that's true anymore, but students also were given safety within the walls of their university, even if they had committed a crime outside or were wanted for any reason. So this is very interesting that Chaucer does this, and Terry Jones will make a lot of points about this, really, in his book, which I will get to. All right. So he leases this residence in the church grounds for, I think, 100 years or something ridiculous. This is 1399. And then in 1400, he dies. And it's unclear how he dies. We do not know. He just disappears from the records. And there's a 16th century tomb in Westminster Abbey, much faded now, that records Chaucer's death as occurring on October 25th of 1400. So, what happens to Chaucer? Well, okay, I'm going to go back now to the D&B, the Dictionary of National Biography, but I'm also going to talk to you a little bit about some biographies about Chaucer. This is a really good one. This is written by Derek Pearsall, who's a friend of mine. You can see it's pretty much flagged by me. This gives you really a lot of good insights into the life of Chaucer. Another one is this more recent one by Marion Turner, who's also someone I know. I haven't read it fully. I do own it. I will get to it. But anyway, it's a book that tries to reconstruct what Chaucer's life must have been like in the 14th century. I would recommend it. I think she's a good scholar. And then we get Terry Jones, Who Murdered Chaucer, a Medieval Mystery. Now, Terry, who you may remember from the Monty Python troupe, Monty Python and the Holy Grail, among others, in this book, he believes that Chaucer was done away with the shift in regime between Richard II and Henry. And he makes a pretty good case for it. This picture, which we'll see again, this is from, you may recognize it, it's from the Corpus Christi College manuscript number 61, and it shows Chaucer reciting to a noble company. The figure in gold is thought by many people to be Richard II, but his face has been wiped out, which may have been caused by censorship. later censorship after Richard II falls from power. Okay, I'm going to go over this pretty quickly so this lecture doesn't go on and on. So we've got Chaucer, born about 1340, dies in 1400, has many day jobs, as we've noticed. We don't know quite when he was born and quite when he dies. His father, John Chaucer, the vintner, the wine seller of London, is married to Agnes Compton, and this was a very prosperous merchant family, middle class, and they had been involved with the export of wool and the importing of wine. So his father was a wine merchant, and they lived in a neighborhood of London where there were many Italians and French people who were importing their wines into the city. So this is probably where Chaucer learned his languages. We also have a great-grandfather who was a taverner, kept a tavern, so he comes from fairly humble origins. And his other grandfather was named Robert Malanle Chaucer, and that means shoemaker. So his other grandfather was likely a shoemaker. So Chaucer's father, though, did very well financially in the middle class. And actually, most poets and artists come from the middle class. There are a few exceptions, but almost all of them come from the middle class, not from upper classes, not from necessarily very rich families. So art and poetry are not the purview only of people who have a lot of wealth. So I'm just going to skip around in the Dictionary of National Biography account, but you can read it. It's posted. There's a little bit about Chaucer's work in the household as a page, household of Elizabeth de Burgh. And we know that Chaucer also was sorry, my papers are going all around here. He was working for the household of Elizabeth de Burgh, which we've said, and that in 1359 Chaucer saw military service in France, probably with Prince Lionel's company, and we think that he may have even been fighting under Edward the Black Prince, who, if you know the film A Knight's Tale, he sort of featured in that movie as a really good guy. Yes, Chaucer marries Philippa Chaucer, and Philippa Rowett is Catherine, who's the wife of Sir Hugh Swynford, but later the mistress and finally the wife of John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster. So he's marrying up. He's marrying out of his social class. His earliest work is probably the Book of the Duchess, which was written to John of Gaunt's first wife it's written actually as an elegy, as a lament after the death of Blanche, who was John of Gaunt's first wife. He's influenced first by French poetry and translates some French work, including a little bit of the Roman de la Rose. He goes to Italy for the first time in the 1370s. And he says that when he was in Italy, he met Petrarch, though we don't necessarily know that's true. But we know that Boccaccio, in particular, was very influential. And what's interesting is that Chaucer mentions Petrarch and meeting him in Italy, but he seems to lift a lot more, or perhaps be inspired more by the stories told by Giovanni Boccaccio. And he never mentions Boccaccio. Now, is this because Chaucer's a plagiarist? Not exactly. It's possible that Chaucer had found a manuscript with Boccaccio's work in it that was unsigned, because as we know, medieval manuscripts do not have title pages, or mostly do not have title pages. Title pages aren't used at all in manuscripts in England. In Italy, it's a little bit different, but not that different. He also encounters the writings of Dante. So Dante's another influence on Chaucer. So those three Italian poets, Dante, Petrarch, Boccaccio, very important on Chaucer's writing. And Chaucer's Troilus poem is very close to another work by Boccaccio. So we've talked about the gallon pitcher of wine daily that Chaucer will get. And that is given in 1377. We've talked a little bit about his accountancy, and that the D&B actually emphasizes that Chaucer was given a lease for life rent-free of a dwelling over Aldgate. So his house that was on the Aldgate, a gate of London, close to the custom house. I don't know how you got up in there, but I guess there were stairs. Yeah. So he's living rent-free, which is nice. And this is probably the period in the 1370s that Chaucer writes Troilus and Crusade, which we'll also read at some point. He also goes on all these royal missions, which I've outlined from the timeline, and he meets a lot of very important people. Something the timeline does not mention, which is kind of important to know about, is that Chaucer is charged with something called raptus by Cecilia Champagne, by Cecily Champagne, who is a young woman who Chaucer seems to have had something to do with. Let's see if I can find my notes on her. Hang on. Here they are. All right. This happens in the 1370s. She is the daughter of a baker. Now, Chaucer's been rising in court through his marriage with Philippa Rowett. So she brings him to court for something called raptus. Now, raptus in the Middle Ages could mean lots of things. It could mean rape. It could mean an affair gone wrong. It could mean kidnapping, though it seems unlikely that Chaucer would be going around kidnapping people. Anyway, we do have the documents on this. And what's interesting here is that in the court case, Chaucer calls all of these very important people to testify to his good character. Sir William Beauchamp, Chamberlain of the King's Household, Sir John Clairvaux, and Sir William Neville, Knights of the King's Chamber, John Philippot, Collector of Customs, Richard Morrill, a London grocer. Grocers were actually quite wealthy in the 14th century. So he calls all these really important people. And Cecily only has two witnesses, a guy who makes knives named Robert Goodchild and a guy who makes armor, John Growth. These are not really important people, I guess, unless you want knives or armor. And Chaucer has to pay her a large sum of money. So what is speculated here is that Philippa Rowett was off with the Queen, which she did throughout her marriage with Chaucer. She just wasn't home much. And Cicely and Chaucer must have had some kind of relationship, it's thought. It could have been blackmail, of course, but I doubt it. It's thought perhaps, since the court record, even today, does not really reflect the reality of what's been happening. It's thought that perhaps there was a child from his assignation with Cecily that she wanted support for, because at the same time, Chaucer's selling a whole lot of property to get money. So that is a very curious document. I can hardly think of Chaucer, who describes himself as quite fat and very tiny, as a rapist, but you never know. But in any case, he was not prosecuted, but he did pay a lot of money. So there's some kind of payoff. We don't know whether it was rape, and we think probably that was the legal recourse Cecily had to get some kind of support from Chaucer. So it's hard to know what exactly is going on there. We do know that Chaucer loves women. We also know about Chaucer that he never says anything bad about anyone directly. He's very indirect in any criticism, which is kind of a charming quality. And he seems to love women and be very positive about them for the most part. So he's in some ways very pro-woman, but then there is this very interesting case. Okay, I'm going to finish going through the DMB, and then that's about all I think this lecture will hold. I can talk to you just off the top of my head about the rest of the material. So Chaucer's productive years, really 1370 to 1400 when he vanishes. Let me see. Okay, I'm still paging through my DMB here. Yes. Yeah, as when he was Justice of the Peace in Kent, this is from about 1385 to 1389, he worked with judges in felony and trespass cases mostly, and also people cheating other people with like measures of cheese or bread, things like that. In 1387, he makes his last mission abroad to Calais. His wife dies that year in 1387. What else have I got to say here? Dresden Crusade, it's finished about 1388, and it survives in 16 manuscripts. Here's another Chaucer initial. This is a picture of young Chaucer again. Here's the Trinity College manuscript 61, where you can hardly see it, but you see Chaucer standing in a pulpit, more or less reciting his poem. There is no book in this picture, to this noble company. This is one of the prefatory paintings. It's a watercolor. It's very odd, to the Troilus manuscript that's in Oxford now, which shows the parting of Troilus and Crusade. Troilus and Crusade survives in 16 manuscripts and 3 early printed editions. It's written before the Canterbury Tales. Chaucer's main source is Boccaccio's poem, is Il Filostrato, the lover of the star. Chaucer keeps to the outline of Boccaccio's plot, but he really elaborates it into a profound treatment of the joy and sorrow of human love. But Chaucer's still working in an official capacity while he's writing this. 1389, as clerk of the king's works. He has to oversee building projects, as I mentioned earlier, and also parks, hunting lodges, the Mews for the Royal Falcons at Charing Cross. So he's got lots and lots of things he's doing. He's also overseeing the building of bridges and the wharf beside the tower and all kinds of things. So he's very busy, and then there's a robbery that occurs. Chaucer is robbed of money in 1390. They stole 20 pounds from him, which would have been quite a lot of money at the time. And that went to trial. Chaucer sort of retires from some of those jobs at that point. But then he becomes the royal forester, so that means overseeing the forest lands. And then the Canterbury Tales is written in the last decade of his life. Some people think it's unfinished, others think it's finished. I tend to think what we've got is what we've got, and it was probably as finished as it was going to get. Let me just see if there's anything else here. Yes, historically, 1399, death of John of Gaunt, and the forced abdication of Richard II. Henry IV, on his accession, confirms Chaucer's annuity of 20 pounds and gives him a further annual grant of 40 marks. But unclear what happens next. Chaucer never really got his full payment from Henry IV. Henry IV doesn't seem to like Chaucer very much. It's just an impression. Let's see if I can just talk to you about some pictures. Let me see if there's anything else here in the DMP. I think that's about it. Terry, in his book, Who Murdered Chaucer, makes a good case for Chaucer kind of going out with the Richard II crew, the people who supported him, and it's worth taking a look at. Okay, I'm just going to talk to you about these pictures now. This is from the Thomas Hockley poem called The Regiment of Princes, which has a picture of Chaucer and has a verse dedicated to Chaucer. And here you see Chaucer with his pen case around his neck holding a rosary, and he's wearing the usual garments of the time. He's got his little kind of veiled hat and that might even be a Leary pipe hat with a tunic. Here we have a 16th century portrait of Chaucer, which is dated 15th century, but it's wrong. This is sometimes said to be a copy of a printed picture of Chaucer. This is another one of the Hockley portrait, which you can see better, which shows him with his rosary. And notice again his pen case around his neck, which is the emblem of the poet. Here he is, 16th century panel painting on wood. A very big nose. Anyway, he's holding a rosary again and really calling attention to that pen case, which is slung around his neck, which is called a penner. Okay, here's from the 16th century editions of Chaucer. Chaucer's very, very popularly read through about the early 17th century, and then he vanishes for a while. Doesn't really come back again until he's recovered in the 19th century, like many medieval authors. Here we see him with his genealogical tree and his knightly shields, though he didn't actually have those. That happens later. And he's standing on his tomb, which is in Ulm, and I've been there. That sort of, I don't know, that thing that looks like a platform on the bottom is actually his tomb in Ulm, which was built by his son Thomas after the death of Chaucer. This is the knight. The knight is the first character described in the general prologue, which I hope we'll get to. And Terry Jones made a good case that this painting of the knight has been censored, and we'll have to talk about that. Here's Terry Jones's book on Chaucer's Knight that came out in the 1970s. I think this edition probably dates from the 1970s. It's the one from my shelf. It was scandalous when it was published because everyone had read the knight as a kind of straight, as a great heroic character, because as you remember in the general prologue, Chaucer describes him as a very partifit, gentle knecht, or knight, which is irony if you look at the full description, as Terry points out. And now Terry's perspective has actually more or less become the scholarly view, but it took a while for that to happen. This is the squire, the knight's son, and we'll read about him again in the general prologue to the Canterbury Tales. He's very fashionable. He's got on his long sleeves, which and his short tunic and his tights to show off his legs. And he's he's described as a lover and a lusty bachelor. So we know what that means. He's a young, vital man. This is the prioress, also described in the general prologue, and she has her own tale, which is a bit appalling, really. She's kind of a terrible character, but Chaucer never criticizes anyone directly, so you have to read the description of her in the general prologue rather carefully. This is the monk. Again, Terry made a point that this has been censored, and indeed I think it has been. Someone has inked over a lot of the costume because the original drawing may have been much more satirical, as Chaucer's description of the monk is. Famous wife of Bath, here she is. Can you read the opening lines? In the old days of King Arthur, of which the Britons speak in great honour, it was this land fulfilled of fair Rhea, the elf queen, with her jolly compania. Anyway, here's the wife. Notice she's riding astride here. Ladies would generally be riding side saddle. And she's dressed colorfully. And some of this will be talked about in not only in the general prologue, but in her tale. Here's from the printed edition, the title page of the printed edition. Now, with print, you do begin to get title pages that tells us that here beginneth the Book of Canterbury Tales that has been corrected and newly printed with a woodcut down here. I think this is of the Squire. I'd have to look that one up. Here are the Pilgrims at the Table from the printed edition, which is rather charming. You see the hogshead on the table there, and they're all kind of squeezed in. And there's someone wearing motley or a fool's hat at the right that you may see there. This is a very famous engraving by the 18th century poet and artist William Blake, which shows the Canterbury Tales pilgrims on their way to Canterbury. So even in the 18th century, Chaucer still has his fans. Oh, and this is the end. This is when Terry Jones came to Pace and came to my classes and talked to us about filmmaking and Monty Python and medieval subjects. He had gotten his degree at Oxford. He's a really smart man. It was a pleasure to host him at Pace. And that's it from me for now.